The War of Spanish Succession was essentially fought between the French Bourbon family and the Austrian Habsburgs, but the winning nation, and the nation which benefited the most from the Peace of Utrecht that ended the war, was actually Great Britain, gaining Minorca, Gibraltar, and Nova Scotia, as well as trading rights in Spain. With France, who started the war, being the closest thing to the war's main loser, these two nations saw opposite outcomes in what seemed to be a war that would have a large impact on the European power structure, yet they had a kind of parallel or similar development in the decades following the war, to the point where the same things were happening at the same time in both France and England.
The first commonality between the two nations in the 18th century was that of government. Britain had been operating under its parliamentary system for a long time, with the Glorious Revolution having been not too long ago. So when George I, a new, foreign, and unpopular king, succeeded the last of the Stuarts in 1714, Parliament continued to act with growing independence and power. France, on the other hand, saw a much more drastic shift when, shortly after the Peace of Utrecht, Louis XIV, who had been ruling France as an absolute monarch for over 70 years, died, leaving his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV, to rule the absolute monarchy that Louis XIV had spent his entire rule creating. Because of this, the nobles of Paris that Louis XIV had worked very hard to keep out of government began to reinstate themselves with French parliaments, almost all of which were courts of law made up of judges who had bought their nobility and who the king could not remove from power. In essence, both nations saw a shift away from absolutism and towards government run by the aristocracy, neither of which were very stable, as there are bound to be many opposing opinions when a large group of people is in power as opposed to one man or woman.
Both England and France had large amounts of debt after this War of Spanish Succession, regardless of who won and who lost. That fact, combined with newly implemented ideas of credit, paper money, large-scale banking, public debt, and growing capitalism in general, caused some serious economic issues. The most notable problem was the appearance of economic bubbles in both England and France at the same time. The heavy involvement of government in the English economy, to the point where the government would give single companies monopolies and then ask for a portion of the profits, for instance, caused debt to be consolidated in private companies and not the government itself. The profits of one of these companies, the South Sea Company, was so largely exaggerated due to new Spanish monopolies that people began to buy stocks at a staggeringly high rate and at exorbitant prices. The company overtook the Bank of England in terms of economic power and took a large amount of the English debt. By the time people began to sell their shares, it was too late, and it finally caused the bubble to burst in 1720, leaving many penniless. In France, the bubble began in 1716, when a Scottish man by the name of John Law created France's central bank for the Duke of Orleans. He also created the Mississippi Company, an organization with a monopoly of trade within Louisiana and the newly created New Orleans. The company subsequently took over all French colonial trade. People began to trade their royal certificates of debt that the government owed them for shares in the company. People bought like crazy due to overinflated profits. This is just like the South Sea Company in Britain. When people realized that those profits were never going to come true, the rapid selling caused the French market to break. This left a bad mark on France as the national bank was destroyed in reaction, and stock market development was stunted much more than in Britain.
Both the economic problems and the growing power of non-royal officials in both France and England converged to allow two men in each country to acquire commanding positions in government. In England, a man named Robert Walpole foresaw and warned against the South Sea situation, and then used his promise to fix the national debt to essentially become England's first prime minister, a position he would hold for 21 years, the longest-serving British prime minister in history. Once in power, he took careful consideration of his actions, focusing most of his energy on keeping in the good favor of the people, and like his French counterpart Fleury, attempting to avoid war at all costs. André Hercule de Fleury served as chief minister to Louis XV for 17 years. Unlike Walpole, Fleury knew that his power only lasted as long as his influence on Louis XV lasted, so he focused less on accruing power over time and more on short-term attempts to make France more wealthy. Both men held power in a 2-decades-long political peace, which was ended when their attempts to avoid war was finally not enough, and both France and England were launched into the wars of the mid-18th century.